Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and it's time for another breakfast with Blaha, eating a little bit of Greek yogurt. We're going to talk about perfect form. Now, some of this, because people will ask, are you knocking certain people? Well, I'm glad you asked. Yeah, I kind of am, because it needs to be said, because they're holding people back. People like Squat University, perfect example. Again, I believe he's a chiropractor. Can't squat anything, obsessed over perfect form, holding people back from loading the weight who need to just load the weight. People like the starting strength people, and I like 90% of their material, by the way. And I think starting strength should be a mandatory read. This idea that there's one squat style. And they may not necessarily teach this at the one-on-one level, but it oftentimes give the impression, or people interpret it, let's put it that way. It may not be their message, it's the way people are interpreting their message. There's one way to squat. And here's our issue with these things. Humans have different structures, right? We are asymmetrical by nature. A lot of people are not aware of that. You're going to have some hip shift and stuff sometimes when you squat, no matter what you do. No matter what you do. A little bit of knee vagus is going to happen when you get really, really heavy. In fact, it's advantageous. There, correctly timed knee vagus can actually add 10 or 20 pounds to your squat if you learn how to use it correctly on a max squat. Okay? And how about your last rep if someone is trying to grind some heavy reps? And the same thing there. Not that I recommend that. I don't program that way. I don't do that. But again, on that final rep. But why is there always going to be potential hip shift and things like that? Because humans are not symmetrical, right? A lot of us have one hip that has a different angle than the other. Look at how much hip joint angle varies in humans. There are studies on this. It's enormous. The amount of angle differences that we have in hip joints as a species in terms of both depth of our hip socket as well as our angles of the hip joint is massively different. We almost look like a different species if you start looking at different people's hip structures. That's how varied it is. It's enormous variation. Not only that, it can vary in a person. You can have one hip that's at a different angle than another. In fact, it's really common, right? Almost none of us have perfect symmetry there. Every one of us have one arm and one leg that's slightly longer than the other. Now, for some people, it can be a big difference. It's probably going to be less than an inch. But it's there. Okay? Your form is oftentimes on big, complex movements going to be slightly asymmetric. And people say, well, could that cause muscle imbalances? Sure. And trying to correct those muscle imbalances might predispose you to more injury, because you develop slight muscle imbalances based around your structure that you need to perform these big lifts. And going out of your way to correct it, well, it might put you in a position to where you're loading stuff incorrectly based upon your asymmetry now. Trying to force it can actually get you hurt. Actually trying to force this symmetrical movement in an asymmetrical body is actually unevenly loading you potentially, depending upon how big your asymmetry is. Right? We're compensating the way that we have to based upon our structure. So if you're trying to force these things or trying to work around it, it's problematic. The same thing people say, well, what if it causes me to have one muscle bigger than another? It's doing that because that's the way that your body has to compensate for your asymmetry. It's what it has to do. And trying to fix it, unless you're going to be a serious competitive bodybuilder, obsessing over it isn't good. It may not help you. In fact, it might bring you back over to, even though the muscles are now balanced in terms of the muscle side to side, they're not balanced in terms of your skeletal structure now. You're creating imbalance by trying to achieve aesthetic balance, potentially, not saying it's guaranteed. So obsession over these things isn't necessarily helpful. And it's holding people back. As so many people are like, I have to have perfect form before I can load the bar. Well, that's ridiculous. You just need to have decent enough form to not get hurt. That's it. For us to keep loading and progressively overload movements, we need the form to be good enough that we can do it safely. That's it. That's all that matters. And if we can do it safely, we can get bigger and stronger. Now, it's not to say that some perfect form won't help you lift more weight. It will. Obviously it will. That's what we call technique. But if you just get bigger and stronger, you're going to lift more weight also. Now, in a perfect world, if you're chasing the best maxes possible, you'll do both at the same time. Why wouldn't you? It makes sense, right? You should continue to refine your form and your technique while getting bigger and stronger. That's the best of both worlds. But you shouldn't be focused on, I need to spend 3 months perfecting this technique before I start loading heavy. That's stupid. You're wasting time. It's holding people back. And we come over to the idea of perfect form from person to person. We have different structures. And what do we mean by structures in terms of leverages? All right, when people say leverages, it's this big mysterious word. What does it mean? How long your legs are, how long your arms are, how long your torso is in relation to each other. That's it. So why does this matter? Well, if you look at the best lifters in the world, look at world record holders in the squat, bench, and deadlift. There's common structures. Right? The people that begin, unless you're someone like John Hack, who's just a genetic freak in every way imaginable, and you're just good at everything, unless you're that person, setting him aside, let's take out people like him. A lot of people are gifted at one lift and they become world record holders at that lift, and they're not always that good at other lifts. What structures do you see? What do the best deadlifters look like? Right? I'm talking guys who pull 800 plus. What do you usually see? All right? I'll probably never deadlift 800 pounds. Let's be honest about it. The guys who pull 800, 900 plus, what do you see for their structure? Usually long legs, long arms, relatively short torso relative to their legs. And a lot of taller guys set world records. Guys 5'11", 6 foot plus. I mean, Blaha 6'8". That's what you see. That's the best deadlifters. Okay? Best squatters, what do we see? We see the exact opposite. All right? You guys have seen me squat 605. Most of you've seen me deadlift is 615, 625 if we count deficits. I have short legs, long torso, so I have short femurs, I have a long torso. Relative to my height, compared to the average person who is my height, I have a longer torso and slightly shorter femurs. That is your squat genetics. And the guys and there are people who are more extreme than me. Those are the people who squat extreme weights. Okay? Of course, I also have long arms, which makes benching harder. Best bench pressers in the world, what do we see? Big, thick chest, short arms. Short arms. Best benchers in the world. Their setups are completely different, especially when the squat and the deadlift. You look at these different numbers. People with longer femurs have to squat. Their squat technique is going to look completely different from someone with shorter femurs like me. Completely different, especially if they got a shorter torso. They've got to go wider. They usually have to low bar it. They have to lean forward more. They have to get a good squat. It's the requirement, the leverages they need. Same thing with a deadlift. All right. People with longer legs have to start with higher hips on the deadlift. On conventional, sumo's a different beast. What do they have to do? And the muscles used on your leg lengths versus torso actually impact whether you use more hamstring and glute versus back. So again, weak point training isn't just about where your muscles are, it's about where your leverages are. But deadlift, longer your legs are, the higher your hips have to start. And you'll see that same mistake. You'll watch someone who has this beautiful, perfect form. They'll watch someone like Ed Cohen with shorter legs, deadlift, right? And like, oh, he squats the weight a little, it's a little more squatty. Starts with lower hips. Then someone who has longer legs, they have to start with higher hips and they're going to lean forward more when they conventional deadlift. The forms are different. They're based upon your individual leverages and what's going to be optimal. And here's the other thing with form. So we discussed all of that for maxing and everything else, right? The perfect form for maxing on a lift may not be the perfect form for hypertrophy on that lift. May not be. In some cases it is, in some cases it isn't. No perfect form. How about injury prevention? Different people, because of the way they're built, where they get inflamed. And I should probably discuss some of this with myself. Some of my lifts, I don't do the version that would necessarily give me the best possible max. It's to keep me in the game longer. It's easier on my joints. I don't get as inflamed. It's almost worth its own video. Best form for maxing may not be the best form for your personal injury prevention. Okay? And if we don't say this and say, oh, there's no perfect form because everyone is different. We need to understand how different people are different and figure out what is acceptable form based upon those differences. But there is no textbook perfect form, at least on bigger movements. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.